Hello everyone, I'm James Rosen.
And I'm Dave Kemble, and this is the Practicus
Digital Transformation Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the latest show in the Practicus Digital Podcast series. Today we are joined by a good friend of mine, Ben Tilley. Ben is a hands-on digital healthcare leader with over 20 years commercial experience. Having started out in web design, he soon moved into the world of e-marketing before finding his passion in the life sciences sector over 10 years ago. He has led numerous digital and multi-channel campaigns successfully and is an all-round great bloke. Ben, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Dave.
So, what does digital mean to you?
It's an interesting question. I think digital probably means a different thing every single day of my job. But ultimately, I think it probably needs to be distinguished as what we're trying to do in terms of multi-channel versus omni-channel. So traditionally, I think we've been in a situation where we've had all these digital tools given to us and we've basically done a bit of push marketing to customers in a bit of an ad hoc way. So that's multi-channel, which is very much, we choose a channel, we use a bit of material to convey across that channel at the customer. And I think those days are numbered, and I think that's pretty old-fashioned in its thinking. I think where we got to get to nowadays is this omni-channel approach where the customer is at the center of what we're doing, and it's much more of a pull marketing. So essentially what we're trying to do is send across communications to the customer at the time that they want it, rather than the time that we feel we need to just push it across.
Interesting. And I remember when we've spoken in the past, you almost don't like the word digital. You found it to be, it puts people off.
Yeah, I think that is the case. I think it could be a bit of a barrier to transformation in organizations, especially when you've got people that are very used to working in traditional marketing, ways of working within marketing. And all of a sudden they've got all of these new technologies. And I think what needs to be conveyed to a lot of people is that actually the way of working hasn't really changed in terms of the mindset of what we're trying to do, which is, the customer comes first, obviously, in terms of what we're, in terms of the materials need to be fit for purpose. So I think, so digital probably is a bit of a double-edged sword in that respect, where it certainly has connotations of techiness and new ways of working, and that's definitely scary for a lot of people. So, given that it's so intrinsic in our everyday working lives now, in our personal lives, almost it doesn't need to be said. It's just there, isn't it? It's like oxygen almost. It just doesn't need to be talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, Ben, you've worked in digital marketing for quite some time now, but I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts on and your experiences. Have you seen any major differences between the sectors? Do some approach it, in a very different way to others?
I think we're playing catch up in pharma. I think traditionally there's probably been a bit of a 10-year gap where, having worked for the likes of Apple and IBM and the BBC, back in 2002 or 3, whenever I was working for Apple, we were creating personas for our digital marketing activities and really thinking about that customer journey using digital. So thinking about things like email and their journey to the website, and then what their behaviors were on the website, so we could then get a sales call to kind of really accommodate that person's need and their based on their behaviors. That just hasn't ever been done in pharma, and certainly since 2011 till very recently. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. And now I think we're playing catch up, and certainly the company that I work for, I've seen some huge strides just in the last sort of year that I've been there, where we're certainly aligning ourselves to that non-pharma way of working, where it goes back to what I was saying earlier on about omni-channel, where we're thinking more in terms of a customer experience rather than a multi-channel marketing approach.
Do you think that's down to the risk-averse nature of the pharmaceutical and life sciences sector, that they haven't got to where other sectors are?
Yeah, I mean, certainly is it risk averse? There is this element of risk averse, absolutely. But I think because of the whole nature of materials being signed off and the way that we work in pharma, any effort needed to launch a campaign digitally outside of pharma is, fairly straightforward. Within pharma, you times that by a factor of 5 or 6 times, really. Maybe that's an overestimate, but certainly there's several, layers of complexity that you need to get over to get the basic stuff done. So you've got so much red tape, I suppose, is the best way to describe it, where you've got to get everything signed off by a medical person. You've got several layers of signatories. You've got to abide by, codes of practice. And you're forever slightly worried that you're going to get into trouble with the PMCPA. So it really becomes a bit of a barrier, the way that pharma sector is set up for, advertising essentially and promoting their products. And I think that's the biggest barrier. It's less about the risks. I think we all know what the risks are, and those risks are common sense almost.
It almost feels like the innovation is so focused on the medicine, on improving people's lives, that part of the innovative side of the business has to focus on that, and therefore perhaps the digital side lags behind. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly in the past that's been the case. As I said, now I think we're seeing a big tidal change. As I said, the company that I'm working for is really, really kind of looking at cutting edge ways of working. But I think you're right. I think there's so much resource on the actual manufacturing and development of medicines that almost the delivery of getting the message out to the customer is a bit of an afterthought. And it still is to a certain extent. One thing that I have noticed is that, we put a lot of effort in thinking about the structure of our approach, and we talk about that structure a lot within internal meetings. And that will, brand planning, things like that will last for several weeks and months. And then, when it actually comes to delivering the tactics, the physical thing that the customer says at the end of it can often be a little rushed and a little, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but it doesn't seem that it deserves the attention. It doesn't get the attention it deserves, I think is what I'm trying to say.
One of the things that we've covered off on some of the previous episodes is that the need to get the absolute sort of the strategy and the overriding goal, really crystal clear from all the stakeholders right at the start. I mean, in your experience, what is a pharmaceutical company's goal when it comes to digital and digital transformation? What are they trying to achieve? What can they achieve?
It is about the customer being at the center, and as I said, it's about having those messages and communications and interactions delivered with the message that's right for that customer, that meets their unmet needs, and is at a time and a channel that suits them. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. But then obviously there's very traditional things that we're attempting to do, which is all about, I guess, the brand adoption ladder, where you've got a mindset of the customer identified, and what then you're trying to do is move them along, to become ultimately, I guess, an advocate for your brand or your product. And now I'm seeing in pharma a lot of work around that customer experience architecture, where we're trying to move a customer along that journey using omnichannel.
So who is the customer then? You talked about the customer then, and you've got to look at it, because my understanding is you're trying to provide information to healthcare professionals, but now you also want to be able to get information to the patients, to key opinion leaders. So who's the customer?
It's a really interesting question, actually, Dave. I think my opinion probably slightly differs to the majority of people in pharma. So I always liken the situation to a dealership where, you've got, BMW, for instance, they have a manufacturing plant in Germany, and then they have people like Cigna in the UK that act as dealerships. And that, to me, is the mindset of, the manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies. So BMW is, the pharma company, and the dealerships, Cigna, for instance, are the doctors. So if you were to ask BMW who your customers are, they wouldn't say the dealerships, they would say the patients. The people that drive the cars, the customers. And in the same way, I think
Sure.
ultimately
Yeah.
our customers in pharma are our patients, and our what we consider customers, the healthcare professional, should be seen more as a partner. And I don't know, maybe it is.
No, that's a good analogy. That does make sense because you want both. You're trying to get the information to the end, the driver, as it were. But in order to do that, the best way to do that is to provide information to the dealership, so that because the drivers are the ones who are going to go into the dealerships to access the BMW, if you like, and so yeah, by giving the right information to both parties, but it's going to be different information.
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely. Of course it is. It's going to be, obviously a specialist doctor is going to be very interested in the science. You do obviously have your patients that are called expert patients, which, the majority of us, when we get an illness like, flu or whatever, we're not really that interested in the physiology of the virus and how it attacks our bodies. We've all been a little bit more exposed to that, I suppose, with the event of COVID, and we know more about viruses. But in the past, certainly that wasn't a thing that we were interested in. But now you've got a lot of patients that have access to obviously the likes of the internet and Google. So if they get a disease, they research it quite heavily. So you do have this subsection of expert patients, which sometimes I think, and I haven't really seen much evidence of it in pharma, where they're not really being catered for. And I don't know whether it's something that they should, because we're not selling directly to the public in that respect. So just to back up, one of the biggest issues in pharma that we have is avoiding selling or promoting our products directly to the public. That is a big no-no for obvious reasons. You can't influence patients and get them to overrule the doctor's decision. It's just not ethical. But there are situations where I think a patient organisation or an individual patient working directly with a pharma company, not necessarily working, but receiving information, potentially could be ethical. If they're on a treatment plan with that doctor already, and their treatment plan's already been set up, then I don't see why there couldn't be a direct engagement with the pharma company and the patient.
Yeah.
Again, that's another really interesting point. But I mean, Dave, you've told me before that pharmaceutical companies are always talking about personalised medicines to ensure that the patients are all treated separately, as opposed to putting people into categories where they shouldn't be. And just from a customer journey perspective, I'm interested to get your thoughts. Can you personalise digital marketing, Ben, in the pharmaceutical sector, and how would that come about?
Absolutely, and that's the thing that we strive to do. So I think having a one size fits all approach just doesn't work. It might work for Mars bars, but it certainly doesn't work for oncology products.
I don't know. I like a big Mars bar.
Well, maybe there's two sections that we could describe for Mars bar lovers. People that like the fun size and the people like the king size.
Do they even do king size anymore? I don't know.
Which is a bit
scandalous.
So, yes, personalization. So, the whole model of pushing a generic message out to a group of customers just won't fly. I think we have to think about where a particular healthcare professional is in their knowledge of a therapy area, in their knowledge of the product that you're trying to talk to them about. Whether it's a dabbler, somebody that's just playing with the product, maybe got a few patients that they want to try it out on, versus where you've got a key opinion leader who's a complete advocate of your product. And talks on your behalf to other healthcare professionals to kind of get the word out, as it were. And I think you've got all the bits in between. So that the message for the dabbler versus the marketing message for the key opinion leader are going to be incredibly different. So you've got a spectrum, and it's it is really difficult. And the great thing is we're in a situation now where we've got some really cool technology that enables us to do that really intense, in-depth analysis of journeys and behaviors and, all the analytics, whether it's sales data or web data or email open data or, just all of the different, data points and touch points that you can collate, you begin to get a really, really nice picture of individual users' needs. And off the back of that, you can use some really sophisticated tools such as Salesforce Marketing Cloud, for instance, to start to really personalize communications. So you end up with a situation, hopefully, and I don't think we're too far away from it, where a customer, when they interact with your touch points, whether that's an email, an account manager, or the website, those interactions will be unique to that very, that single healthcare professional. No two healthcare professionals will have an identical experience with your brand, because we've got so much information or so much knowledge about what that person needs. And we've got the capabilities now to actually deliver personalized content on websites and emails and presentations and all those sorts of things.
That's really interesting. And we talked about in previous podcasts the relationship with technology, and you mentioned earlier, digital is all around us, much like oxygen, and it's going to be interesting to see over the next 10, 20 years how much further we can go with using technology and digital in everyday life to improve individual experience, individual lives, and hopefully ease the burden on the NHS as well. You talked about earlier the access of information, and you're absolutely right. I think now we're all used to be able to access any information we want. We all just jump on Google, and if we do have an ailment, we go straight on and go, right, what's wrong with me? What do I need? And it's a very, very interesting journey. And what's your thoughts with regards to remote consent now? Because is there anything we could have done differently to ensure the minimal impact of coronavirus? Because access to healthcare professionals has clearly been massively affected over the last year. Is there anything that you think the pharmaceutical world could have done differently, or a different platform could have been used?
It's almost beggars belief, really, that we've had the ability to send emails and promotional emails certainly since I've been working. So over 20 years, let's say 25 years, the ability to send out promotional emails has been there. And I've worked for several companies, absolutely wouldn't name them, but that just don't have an e-permission database set up. They have no e-permissions at all, just for the simplest thing of sending an email. So absolutely, we could have done a lot to mitigate the situation we found ourselves in with coronavirus, which would have been to collect e-permissions in the past. The trick is now how we do that, and it is very difficult because we've got a situation where we almost have to get an e-permission for everything that we do digitally. So to give you an example, traditionally you wouldn't need permission to ask a doctor to send them an invite to a face-to-face meeting at their surgery. But because we're now doing it digitally and remotely using things like Teams and Zoom, we have to gain consent from the HCP to be able to send them an invite to a meeting digitally, which is slightly crazy, but that's the way the world in pharma works. So we really, this is where we really, really found ourselves stuffed up. So not only did we not have access to people physically, we now found ourselves without e-permissions for this particular activity, where we had to go through a bunch of hoops and jump through a bunch of, hoops basically to get that e-permission. And it's difficult, you've got several barriers. So an account manager's got, to get past the receptionist, potentially project practice manager. We've then got to get, verbal consent from the healthcare professional to be able to send the permissioned email. The healthcare professional has to then reply to that email. And then you can then send them an invite to have a meeting with them. So it's a
Unbelievable.
nightmare. I mean, there is some flexibility in that where we can potentially ask a receptionist for permission to send the healthcare professional the permission. So it kind of makes it a little easier in some situations, but it's still very, very challenging.
It sounds it, and we've seen and experienced over the past sort of year to 18 months, how different companies and industries have adapted to this new world that we're living in, and the way that we're all going to be working moving forwards. I suppose. So, do you think that the regulations in the pharmaceutical sector, are fit for purpose for this new digital world we're moving
I think
into?
so. I think absolutely, and they need to be there. The regulations are fit for purpose. The interpretation maybe isn't. I think is probably the best way to describe that. I think quite rightly, you've got people whose jobs are on the line that sign off materials and agreeing to activities that are maybe slightly in the grey area of the guidelines. And I well, or perceived to be in the grey area of the guidelines, I think is probably more accurate. Because if they are in the grey area, then it probably shouldn't be done. But if it's on that line, on that edge, then people quite rightly get nervous, and it is a huge block and it is a huge barrier. And my advice to anybody working in pharma and in doing new projects is get your medical team and your regulatory team on board right at the very inception of that project, and try not to. I've seen several companies where you've got quite a high churn rate of medics signing off things, and that becomes a big barrier. So, if you're a company in charge of retention, make sure that you keep your medics on board, because otherwise it's a huge disruption to your business where you've got new medics coming in trying to get their head around a particular project. They don't know the legacy behind that project and might feel nervous, and therefore would recommend scrapping the whole thing, which I've seen multi-million-pound projects happen to. So regulatory the rules and regulations around pharma are there for a reason, to protect patients and to ensure that we're not doing things like disguised promotion, where you set something up as an educational forum, and when the customer gets involved in it, you end up promoting to them, which is a complete no-no. So there's lots of things there that are there for good purposes, but absolutely we need to be just a little bit more agile in our thinking sometimes.
Yeah. You talked about the ethics earlier of access to the inverted commas customer, and depends which customer. And you and I have talked in the past about digital ethics, and I know we were having quite an interesting chat about the fact that you can now do micro analysis of expressions. So in a scenario where you're having a Teams call, I mean, we've all been there where we have a call with an individual. Do you mind if we record this call? And of course you don't. You have no problem with anyone recording a Teams call or a Zoom call. But if they said, we will micro-analyze every single expression that you make during this call so that we can then better understand you as an individual and how to sell to you more effectively, where do you draw the line?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And it's almost that age-old argument about Google Ads, where I think they give an option, or they used to, where you have a switch that says, I want to receive relevant ads to my needs. You can switch that off, which basically they stop tracking your, well, they don't, but they're supposed to stop tracking your behaviours and getting Alexa and and whoever to listen on your conversations so they can give you targeted. So that's the comparison that I draw. So it depends on what side of the fence you come down on. Are you happy for your behaviours to be analysed to the degree that you are then only bothered or interrupted with relevant things, or would you rather them ignore all your behaviours and you just get non-targeted annoying adverts? And by the way, I'm not saying that I'm on one side or the other. I've got feelings for both, but the whole micro expression analysis thing is really, really interesting. And just to kind of get people to understand what that is, essentially, if anyone's ever watched a program called Lie to Me with Tim Roth, basically he is trained to read people's micro expressions, and a micro expression is something that everybody does when they're faced with a new situation or some new information, or they're told something, and it's something that's almost imperceivable by most people. And what it is it's a flash of expression that happens across your face. And I think there's 7 categories, and I can't remember them, but they're things like disdain, anger, disgust, and there's some positive ones as well. Happiness, I can't remember, sadness maybe, worry, I don't know, but there's definitely these core group of micro expressions that, you know, an FBI agent, for instance, could use to discern whether somebody's telling the truth, or, you know, whatever. So the whole premise of this micro expression analysis topic was that there was some software that enabled an account manager to have a conversation with a customer, deliver content verbally and visually via what we call an e-detail, which is essentially an online presentation around trial data and things like that. And then the software would record concurrently those interactions alongside the micro expressions of that customer. And at the end of the call, it would amalgamate them to basically show you what impact each of the interactions or each of the sequences of the call had, whether it, you know, be something that the account manager said or showed via the presentation, what the consequence was from an emotional perspective on that customer. And I think that I felt 2 things about that. I thought, firstly, you know, how many people would agree to their micro expressions being analysed, you know, because where does it stop?
Yeah.
And I think actually in the field, everyday use, it's not probably appropriate for now, at least, you know, until people perhaps become a bit more comfortable with how the data's being treated. But I think that's the biggest issue. People don't really know. People don't really understand what happens with their data. And, you know, for good reason, because it probably nobody really knows. You know, you've got Hawaii and people like that doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But where I did think that it had a really good application was in the development of materials. So when you've got a group of, we call them ad boards, so you've got a group of healthcare professionals,
like patient advocates.
So it's market research essentially. So you create a series of materials, and you go through the interactions with your customer, you know, your customer group who's acting as your what's the word, your market research people. And they're fully aware of what you're doing with the data, and they're fully aware that you're, you know, analysing their micro expressions, and you're getting instant feedback to see how that content's landing. I think that's probably somewhere where it does have value.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's interesting. As you've been talking, I've been thinking to myself, I'd almost like someone to switch it on and try and beat the machine. So
yeah. You've been watching too much Blade Runner.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic! And yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we will accept certain things over the years that creep in, and for example, your Tesco's Club Card or any loyalty scheme, we know what's happened. They know they're tracking exactly what we're buying, when we're buying it, what our shopping patterns are like. We know that Amazon are tracking it, and they send us adverts, and it works. The interesting thing I saw the other day, I think it was on the Dragon's Den, there's a chap who's invented or created a company now that allows you to sell your data, and he was talking about
really interesting.
Yeah, it's all around cookies, and he was talking how it's marketing's greatest trick, etc. It's fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think I did see that, and wasn't it kind of banded around as the best Dragon's Den pitch of all time? Yeah, I did see that, and you know, it goes back to that whole debate we have about Apple as well. You know, when you download new bits of software, or sign to a new service, you know, you've got reams and reams and reams and reams of terms and conditions that you just tick, right? Because you want the bit of kit. You want it now. You don't want to wait until you've read 2 hours worth of T's and C's. You know, in that whole idea of people selling data to other companies like the Dragon's Den chap, relies wholeheartedly on people being lazy and not reading their terms and conditions. And the problem is, then people then are in uproar about the way that the data is being used. But they have technically agreed to it, although I do think that the way that the terms and conditions are laid out is a complete barrier, and it is there and it's designed for people not to read it. So it's it's not a great situation.
Well, there was a South Park episode all around that. I remember, this was some time ago, and it was directly linked to that around terms and conditions. One of the kids signs up to something that has got 4 or 5 hours at 1,200 pages. And as a result, men in black suits with the sunglasses turn up and bundle him into a car, and off he goes. Well, no, you signed it. Yeah.
I also remember an advert where I think it was Wyclef Jean was working for Virgin Media or promoting Virgin Media, and he signed an autograph for a little old lady, and then on the other side it was a contract, and he had to go and be a cleaner. It was very good. So it's been around for a while, I think.
Fantastic. Ben, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been really interesting. Always,
really
always
appreciate
a pleasure
that, Ben. Thanks a lot. Really good insights.
Some fantastic stuff. And guys, thanks for listening. If you have any questions for Ben, you can either reach out to James or I, or reach Ben Tilley on LinkedIn. You can reach me on email at dave.kemble@practicus.com.
And me at james.rosen@practicus.com.
Thanks ever so much. That's a wrap.